Okay, we are here on Angelsea looking at the diesel engine. This is a Westerbeek 4-cylinder diesel, and we're going to go through a number of the checks that we would do before starting the engine. And on this boat, as on many, if you want to check the water strainer, you do that before you open the valve. But in this case, I wanted to actually, even though there's nothing in the strainer, we use the flashlight. I do want to show how you do test the strainer, or check the strainer and replace the, we see the strainer, which has nothing in it, nice and clean. But what's important is when you put this back in, you have to make sure it sets down in, and you can see it went down into its proper seating position, because if you don't do that, you're not going to get a good seal and you'll get a fairly significant leak or possibly even damage the strainer. So we have checked the strainer and put that back in, and it you're seeing that it's nice and clear behind it, although somewhat milky because the glass should probably be cleaned at some point, but it's definitely clear. As we look further along the line, we see the raw water pump. In this case, the access to the raw water pump is a little more difficult than on some boats, and it's the plate with 4 screws is on the back side, which is a little tricky to get to. So you definitely have to have a short screwdriver or a socket to be able to take that off to access the impeller if you were need to either check that or replace it. So that's a little more challenging, but there's plenty of room to be able to do that. Okay, the water then goes, and we're going to go to the back of the engine. Nice thing about Angelsea is you have very good access on the front and back of the engine, and so we can clearly see the heat exchanger, which is this long tube, and it's very similar to what we have on some of the other boats. There's access if you were need to get any debris out of the heat exchanger. You can take these plates off and remove, say, impeller parts, for example. But anyway, that then goes, raw water then gets injected into the exhaust at this point and goes into the aqualift and then gets pumped out. We're going to take the key off, open the raw water through hull, which is what you would do after you've checked that strainer. But one other difference we have on Angelsea is that some of the raw water is used to lubricate the packing gland, which it's not actually a traditional packing gland, it's a dry gland, but the water is used to lubricate it. So in this boat, you don't get dripping from the packing gland because it's a it's lubricating with the raw water. So we're now out back on the front of the engine. We're going to talk about the freshwater system, which is again 50% antifreeze. Here's the reservoir on top of the engine with the coolant tank over here, which always needs to be checked to make sure it's at the proper level. The coolant will then pass through a thermostat, which will open after the engine is warmed up, and this is then the freshwater pump, and once it goes through the engine, it then goes back to that same heat exchanger that we talked about earlier and recycles back to the main tank. What it also does, and it's seen in these tubes down here, these tap off, and this tap off, I believe, is from the heat exchanger, where this goes off to the water heater, which is under the main sink. So if you ever had a coolant leak, that is one of the places you'd want to check. Now, actually, while we're here looking down, you look under the engine and you see that the white absorber is white. You always wanted to check. That's one of the first things I check when I look at an engine. If it's black, there's an oil leak. If it's yellow, there's a coolant leak. And if there's water down there, well, something's leaking in the one of the the raw water system. So that's a quick way to check things. So we've covered the raw water and the freshwater system. Let's talk about the fuel system. The main fuel tank is in the main salon, and if you take a look over here, you can see there's actually two fuel lines coming in, one of which is tapped off. That dates back to where there were some issues with the fuel lines clogging. That hasn't been a problem for probably at least 10 years, but there's still the two fuel lines, one of which is closed off both here and at the tank. We then have the Raycor filter and separator, which you always want to check. And you can see nice pink diesel fuel. And that then goes to a filter and the high pressure pump, which is again on the starboard side of the engine. Okay, let's see. One other thing that's unique to Angelsea is there's a fuel pressure gauge, and this also dates back to when there was that clogging issue. It's not used right now, but if you're ever wondering what that is, it would measure the actual fuel pressure. Okay, we're back behind the engine again, and this is the fuel line coming from the Raycor and the separator. It comes to an electric lift pump, which then goes through another filter and then to the high pressure pump. So it's important if you ever had the lift pump not working. If you look where my finger is pointing, you'll see a, can you see that in there? Maybe come in from this angle. The red wire, which has some tape around it, is the DC power that goes to the lift pump. If that becomes disconnected, you won't have the lift pump, and the engine probably will not start. So that's important. The reason it's got tape around it is if that happens to short to any of the metal and to ground, it can cause a circuit breaker to pop. And while we're back here, this is the circuit breaker in question. It's a 20 amp breaker. This is basically the same as on the universals, which means the medium boats, island side, and the 30s. This is a breaker that feeds the main panel, instrument panel, back in the cockpit. And so that would be one possibility. If this wire were to short, that would cause that to pop. And then you're not likely to get the engine started. Angelsea's electrical system is a little different definitely from the medium boats and some of the large boats. And the two large house batteries are right below us, and you can see a very heavy electrical cable, which then comes over to our battery selector, and we're going to come around to the companionway back into the aft cabin, where we've seen the selector, which is in this case always kept on both, and we also have a green LED which says combiner. That's because on Angelsea, besides the two large house batteries, there's a separate start battery. They are always both charged, either from the battery charger or from the alternator, and when the combiner light is on, they're combined. Now, if there were a problem with a battery, or for example, if you're out on a cruise and you took your house batteries down, the combiner will disconnect so that you don't discharge your starter battery. You do have the option on a cruise of the two house batteries being selected as one or two separately, or you can leave it on both. There is a way to look at amp hours, but we'll discuss that a little bit later. There's a key switch, and this is on the companionway. If your starter battery were to fail and you needed to connect the house batteries to start the engine, you actually have to turn this switch on. And then you have the house batteries that can start the engine. So that's a unique feature of on Angelsea that you have to really be aware of, especially if you're out cruising. Okay, so this compartment right at the base of the stairs is the battery compartment. And we have two very large house batteries, and this is not something that you would typically need to access, but if there were an electrical problem, you may want to check to make sure that the connections were solid here and not have gotten loose. But definitely two very good high amp hour batteries. What I want to show now is some of the other plumbing that we have on Angelsea, some of which is used and some which is not. So here we have the freshwater pump that pressurizes the water for use in the sinks and shower, etc. But we also have a couple other through holes which we do not use, and you can see they have cable ties holding them closed. This is actually for the refrigerator compressors, and we'll point out where those are in a minute. But these stay closed because we typically don't have extremely high temperatures here. If you were, say, in Florida, you may need to cool your compressors, but that's not been an issue here on in Channel Islands or out on the islands. So we're going to now move over, and the compressors are actually under this compartment, which is full of pots and pans. But if you were to empty this and take out a panel, you would see our compressors. Probably more importantly is you'll see two switches over here that are called refrigerator water that runs those pumps. They should not be turned on because the pumps will not function. So those are two switches you would never want to turn on. The compressors work just fine without their water cooling. Angelsea has two heads. This is the aft head, pretty standard. And this will then pump into the holding tank, which is right over here. And you can see we have the holding tank. We also have the aft head discharge through hull, and down here we have the macerator through hull. So macerator through hull is something you would want to open before you were to turn on the macerator. And what the cameraman is holding up is actually what is making the noise. That is a bubbler for the holding tank. It does a good job of putting air into the holding tank, which helps cut down on odors. Now, if this runs continuously, if it were to drive you nuts while you were trying to sleep here, you can actually take the fuse out to turn it off. But otherwise, it's a nice gray noise background that might help you sleep. Angelsea has a forward head. It is totally independent, which is nice in case there were an issue with one or the other. But it means that there's a separate holding tank for the forward head, which is under here. And so there is, again, a completely separate through hull for the macerator and a separate macerator. So totally separate, completely separate heads and holding tanks. So that's important to understand. Okay, we are on Angelsea looking at the instruments first, and we have our chart plotter, which is now turned on, and then up forward of that we have our depth gauge, wind meter, knot meter, an older GPS, which is no longer used, and then our autopilot. Autopilot on Angelsea is significantly different from many of the medium boats in that it is in the stern lazarette attached directly to the rudder post. And so it's not tied to the wheel itself, and that's important because on Angelsea we have two wheels that are cross-connected by cables, and so if the cable breaks, you lose both wheels, but the autopilot mechanism is unaffected because it's attached directly to the rudder post. So if you were to lose your steering with a broken cable, the quickest way to get control of the boat is to turn the autopilot on, because it will then steer the boat. You can also use the emergency tiller, but actually it is much easier to use the autopilot because you have fairly heavy boat, and dealing with the emergency tiller can be challenging under any kind of wind and seas. So that's a unique feature of Angelsea. Now, also and we're talking about down in the aft starboard lazarette, that's where that motor is, but also down there there's a wiring interface that connects the instruments up in the cockpit to a lot of the instrumentation down in the salon. And you typically don't have to do anything about that, but you have to be careful not to, if you're putting things into the lazarette, to snag any of the wires. It's along the outside bulkhead. Additionally, in that section of the lazarette is the shower for the swim step, and those hoses are hanging down, so those are also something not to inadvertently snag, because then it'll, if you have the pressurized water system on, it'll just pump water into the bilge, and that's happened before. Also down below, and probably seen easier from the other lazarette, is, and so we're talking about the aft port lazarette, we have the master breaker. So if shore power doesn't come on, you can check the master shore power breaker. It's a 120 volt, 30 amp breaker. And there's a knob right to the forward of it, which is a volume control for the speakers. And there's actually, I think that's control for both speakers back here. Now, in the lazarette, there is a third anchor, which is, I think, labeled Angelsea Do Not Remove. It's a Danforth, and then there's a red bag that should have the rod and chain associated with that anchor. So you've got a bow anchor, you've got a stern anchor, and now you've got a third anchor for those especially rough days out at the islands. Okay, we also have a fire extinguisher in that port lazarette, and that's handy to have one back here.